So lately there's been a fuck ton of rumors around a new Switch coming out. This happens about every year around this time, but it's even more prevalent this time around because Tears of the Kingdom came out, and while Tears of the Kingdom was a very good game and had very stable 30 FPS, there was sections where it was 20 FPS when you have your master handout, and in this section that I'm showing right now, you can see when there's a lot of apples, there's a lot of lag, especially in this area. This is the most intense area in all of Tears of the Kingdom. This is one apple forest because of all the physics objects that are on screen, and the trees actually come to life, so there's AI it has to calculate, and it's a very memory bandwidth limited area. So, could Switch 2 fix these issues? Most definitely, easily. It would just power through this little section by just having a higher memory clock. But what would a Switch 2 actually look like? And that's what I'm going to discuss in this video. So what's the dream for Switch 2? 8K 60 FPS, 4K 120 FPS? That's certainly possible, right? No, not even slightly. And we're gonna go over that bit by bit in this video. But for now, let's enjoy some glorious Breath of the Wild at 4K 60 FPS. Alright, this is editing Kris here. What you're seeing right now on the screen is 8K internally resolution for Breath of the Wild using the CMU emulator. I also have a graphics pack, a shader pack to it, so that's why it's a little bit darker than you would see in a normal Breath of the Wild game. It's just to give it a bit more pop to the colors and everything else like that, and I'm reckoning it looks real nice, but for the most part you can see that there's a lot more resolution to these monsters and everything else in the game world. But with this 8K footage, I'm not actually hitting 60 FPS here. I am hitting probably around 42, 45, according to at least the frame rate thing from Rumours Statistic Tuner. But I thought it was still interesting to show off nonetheless. Especially this next shot here, which is just in the Hyrule Fields itself. And you can see that with the grass draw distance pushed up a lot, it looks a lot more consistent than compared to Tears of the Kingdom, where it's not as consistent and obvious. And plus you get to have this lovely shot of Link running away from bats. This shot here, I just wanted to show off how the effects look at a higher resolution. I think at this point I've swapped to 4K, so it should be looking a bit better there. This one I just wanted to show off how the lighting looks in the morning and just how good the art in this game looks. David Jaffe recently said, "How dare people think Zelda graphics looks good? It looks terrible." And I'm like, David Jaffe, you're looking at it in the worst possible circumstance there. You look at it in the best circumstance, like in the golden hours and the sun hours. I'm going to put a picture on the screen here right now of an image that I took in Tears of the Kingdom where you see the golden hour looks really great. But in the footage that I'm showing in the background here, we can see that the mountain at the back there, the textures are wobbling in and out because of how the render distance works for the Wii U version of the game. And you can kind of see these a little bit in Tears of the Kingdom, but it's a lot harder to see because of the post-processing. This is just a comparison shot between the CMU version and Tears of the Kingdom in a very close location to each other. It's not quite perfectly lined up, but it's as good as I can get, and you can really see how much the game looks improved when you use, well, more performance to the horsepower. I think it looks good. So that's about it. If you want to know how to use this emulator to get 4K Breath of the Wild, I can't exactly help you because Nintendo doesn't allow it, but I'm sure Google will help you in your endeavors. Alright, back to the video. Enjoy. So what do we need to achieve this goal of 4K 60 FPS I mean, clearly we can do that, right? We can get 4K, we can get 60 FPS, why can't we do that with the Switch 2? So let's break it down in a few ways. One, let's look at other hardware that's out there and what sort of performance they get and what power usage they use to get there. Now, this information is not personally gathered by me. I don't have access to a Steam Deck or ROG Ally or any of those other handheld devices by AMD. However, I can use their data to extrapolate to create points. So we can look at a Steam Deck and an ROG Ally and we can see that they're targeting the 720p and they're going to try their best to hit 60 FPS. Now in modern games, this isn't necessarily possible to get 60 FPS even at 720p. So there's not really a lot of hope that the Switch can get that. But the other problem is these consoles, these handheld devices, have a much higher power usage target. They're aiming around 15 to, in some cases, 40 watts of power, which is quite a lot of power when you look at what their batteries actually are, which is 8,000 milliamps, which is around 40 watt hours. So if they are using around 15 watts of power, which they're not, they're using more than that, they're going to get around 2 to 4 hours of battery life, which isn't long. And I don't think Nintendo is going to want that short of a battery life for their console. They're going to want a bit more out of their kit. So they may be targeting probably 10 watts with 15 watts as the maximum power target. So we're going to have to limit their results at 720p to get what the results at Switch 2 could be. However, this is AMD's drivers and AMD's performance. Nvidia's performance could be a lot better or a lot worse. We don't know because we don't have an equivalent Nvidia machine out there in the market. But what we do know is Nvidia will use frame generation or frame upscaling for AI using DLSS and DL motion smoothing, I'm going to say. They usually call it DLSS 3.0, so they're going to get frame generation as well. Would that be usable on the Switch if it's, say, rendering around 20 frames per second and then doubling that to 40 FPS? I don't think that's going to be really viable. Let's say they're rendering at 30 FPS and doubling that to 60. Is that viable? I think it's a little closer to viable, but from other people's first-hand experience, you tend to notice the lag with a 30 FPS renderer being upscaled, frame generated to 60 FPS. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility. What about DLSS itself? Can't they use that to get more frames per second? And yes, they can in a lot of cases, but that's only when you're trying to upscale content to a better looking image. For example, you're upscaling from 1080p to 4K on a PC, you can very much see there's a marketable improvement over 1080p native, but you're going to see a noticeable reduction in performance. So we're going to let Alex break this down just a little bit, and Alex is from Digital Foundry.
110.6 int 8 tops here, around 5.5 times more machine learning capability in real time than a theoretical Switch 2. On the left hand side, I'm going to add in an image here of the game running internally at 1080p without anti-aliasing and just being upscaled to 4K with the game's native scaler with a 4K HUD. Essentially, the left-hand and right-hand images here have the exact same internal resolution, but the right-hand image with DLSS has DLSS's anti-aliasing and DLSS's reconstruction of that image up to 4K. By measuring the performance difference between these two scenarios left and right, we can get a snapshot at the individual end-to-end cost of DLSS 2.2 and Doom Eternal. 1080p without anti-aliasing is around 110 frames per second here, while 4K DLSS at that same internal resolution is around 90 FPS. The number we're interested in here though is not the frames per second difference, but the cost of DLSS per frame. On the left, each frame is rendered on average in 9.2 milliseconds, and on the right with DLSS, it's 11.1 milliseconds on average. The difference means an end-to-end added cost for DLSS that is 1.9 milliseconds to give the game its anti-aliasing and make it look like a 4K image. Now, the total cost of DLSS is maybe higher, as Doom Eternal does have asynchronous compute, which can hide some performance costs, but this is the end-to-end increase in milliseconds, and it gives us a great base to work with for assessing what Switch 2 might have. Assuming a linear scaling factor between 110.6 tops of the 2060 here from this scenario to 20 tops of a possible Switch 2, 4K DLSS could add around 10.5 milliseconds end-to-end per frame on that theoretical Switch 2 hardware in a game like Doom Eternal.
Now, in case you couldn't quite keep up with what Alex was saying, he's saying that DLSS will have a cost in performance, but give a better looking image at the same resolution. If you are only just barely hitting the 60 FPS target before DLSS improves the image, you will fall behind that targeted frame rate once DLSS comes into the picture. It isn't a free cake. He also went on to explain what his expected cost would be with similar hardware, and he proposed that a possible Switch 2 would cost around 10 milliseconds of rendering budget, which means if you were to hit a 60 FPS frame rate, which has a frame time of 16.66 recurring ms, you would lose most of your budgeted frame interval into improving your image with DLSS. And with the remaining 6 to 7 ms, it's going to be an incredibly hard task to render that image before giving it over to the AI upscaler. And that frame rate that you would need to hit would be around 140 FPS, which just seems incredibly unlikely when every single other piece of hardware is struggling to hit 60 FPS without any up-res component whatsoever. Personally, however, I think the DLSS AI chip that they would have would be a much more custom design and much more efficient than what Alex was saying. And I'm sure they could improve that DLSS even further because they are using a new form of asynchronous rendering when it comes to these AI features inside these NVIDIA chips. And that means I think their budget could be closer to around 6 ms than the very unforgiving 10 ms. This would give us a budgeted frame interval of 11 to 13 ms. Now, this is still not a lot of time to render the image, but it would be around 75 to 90 FPS, which is a lot better than 140 FPS to render without DLSS. What does this mean for us in DLSS? Does this mean it is completely unusable at 60 FPS ever on the Switch 2 hardware? Well, in a power constrained mode, it is very unlikely that they'll hit 60 FPS with DLSS. However, if they are targeting 30 FPS, that would give them a much bigger budget window for rendering the frames. Now, at DLSS with 30 FPS, the frame interval time is 33.33 recurring ms. And if you're losing around 3 to 5 ms of that budget, you would only need to render around 35 FPS without DLSS. And that's usually what a 30 FPS V-synced frame rate game would tend to want to hit, so it always hits the V-sync render window of 30 FPS. And that's currently what Tears of the Kingdom is hitting right now. So that means it is theoretically possible to use DLSS at 30 FPS in a power limited mode. However, this is based on modern titles, meant to be played on as broad market of devices as possible, instead of for dedicated hardware. Now, we've seen some miracle ports to show up on the Switch, and they show what can be done with very limited hardware and very limited rendering budgets. And I'm sure when there is a will, there is a way to get 60 FPS DLSS working within a 10 to 15 watt budget. Plus, Nintendo's art teams are the best in the world at making this stuff happen within these budgets. But this is all for the handheld version of Switch 2. What about if we weren't so power limited? Say we were plugged into the wall and then plugged into the TV itself. Could it be possible there? Personally, I don't see Nintendo allowing two different power budgeted versions of the Switch, because they know people will hack these switches to get that other power budget in the handheld mode. However, for fun, let's say they do allow us to draw some more power. Maybe around 10 to 15 watts more power, so it'd be around 20 to 25 watts. Could DLSS 4K 60 FPS be possible? For this information, we need to head back to the numbers, Mason. What are the numbers, Mason? We look at the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck again in these higher power budgeted states, and again from data which I haven't personally collected, we can see that they do hit around 75 to 80 FPS, and that is within our DLSS window for these up-reses to hit 60 FPS, which means it's theoretically and entirely possible that when the Switch 2 is docked, we could get 4K 60 FPS up-resed. However, this content will be 720p up-res to 4K, and that won't be the best looking image in the world. It will still look way better than 720p, but not as good as you really want it to be. Much more likely is they'll be up-resing to 1440p. Now this image won't be, again, as good as we're all expecting, but it's going to be a hell of a lot better than what's happening right now. Now before you go out there and going, ding dong, The Witch is dead, Switch 2 is going to be the greatest gaming console ever, because The Witch isn't dead, and she ain't, there are many other things that will prevent this fantastical future from happening. One, we don't know what, if any, of Nintendo's plans with AI are. Two, we don't know if Nvidia has an AI design efficient enough to fit into this very power limited budget of the Switch 2 in portable and non-portable versions. And three, Nintendo prefers stability over innovation whenever they can. Just because they can do something does not mean they will do something. All this brings us to the end of the video. I hope you guys liked what I've shown today. Hope it makes you think. I ask you to subscribe to me because I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs, and that will allow me to monetize through YouTube systems. And in the comments below, tell me where my math has failed me, as it often does, especially when converting from frame time to frame rate and back again. It does, however, seem to be quite a bright future for the Switch 2. But the earliest we'll even see a Switch 2 will be around 2 years unless they announce tomorrow. See ya!